Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Matthew Allen. I'm a fellow in the State Society and Governance in Melanesia program here at the Coral Bell School. And in this brief lecture today, I'm going to be talking about the topic of conflict and insecurity in Melanesia, perspectives on natural resource conflict. Now, it's going to be a lecture in two parts. So in the first part, I'm going to be providing a little bit of an overview of some dominant perspectives on this contemporary phenomenon of intrastate conflict in developing country contexts. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on what we might refer to as resource conflict perspectives. So these are perspectives that are attempting to explain this apparent association or correlation between resource abundance and armed intrastate conflict. So a kind of correlation that we see throughout the developing world or throughout the global south. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on in the first part of the lecture. And then in the second, I'm going to, I guess, apply some of these perspectives to two case studies from Melanesia, from the Western Pacific, Bougainville and Solomon Islands, and indeed these two cases are easily the most serious conflicts that the region has witnessed since the Second World War. And in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to be suggesting an alternative framework, one which I will be calling a political ecology framework, as a more appropriate or better way to really come to terms with, to grapple with the causes and dynamics of natural resource related conflict in this part of the world. So I'd just like to make two kind of observations at the outset. I'm going to be talking about violent conflict today, and I think it's important that we note from the outset that conflict, armed conflicts, are never monocausal. They're always the product of myriad causes at different scales. Social scientists often talk about violent conflict as being driven by both structure and agency. There are both kind of deep-seated historical causes as well as more proximate or triggering causes. But despite this, there's been a tendency, an ongoing tendency in the literature to try to come up with a single explanation for armed conflict. People have spoken about kind of war's master narratives, so things like ethnicity or resource scarcity or whatever. But let's note from the beginning that conflict is always the outcome of a complex interaction of different factors at different scales of structure and of agency. We also have a tendency to think of conflict as something that is inherently negative, something that when it occurs needs to be stopped, prevented, stamped out. But I'd like to suggest from the outset that conflict also has the ability to be socially and politically generative, and by this I mean that from conflict, from violent struggle, we have seen historically the emergence of institutions which are more inclusive and which are more durable. And I guess the best example of this is the evolution of the liberal nation state in Western Europe. Underpinning the liberal democracies of Europe has been hundreds of years of violent conflict, and through that process we've seen the emergence of what we might call liberal institutions that are able to contain contestation and political conflict without it becoming violent. So conflict can be socially generative. It can contribute in really fundamental ways to processes of state formation. I'd also like to just flag at the outset the findings of the 2011 World Development Report. This is a big annual report that the World Bank puts out. There's a different topic or focus each year. And in 2011, the title of the World Development Report was Conflict, Security and Development. And the take-home message, if you like, is that violent conflict in developing country contexts, violent conflict occurs at the overlapping boundaries of socio-economic inequality and identity. And by identity, here I mean things like ethnicity, religion, and other forms of identity such as gender, youth, class, and so on. So that's just another point to bear in mind at the outset. Okay, so here's a map of the region that I'm going to be talking about. Oceania, the South Pacific, is commonly divided into these three culture areas of Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. Now I'm going to be focusing today on Melanesia, the Western Pacific. And indeed, in terms of population, Melanesia is easily the most populated part of the region of Oceania, accounting for around 65% of the total population of Oceania. And in particular today I'm going to be focusing on Bougainville, which I think you might be able to see there between the kind of islands of Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. And Bougainville is indeed now, following the civil war there, an autonomous region of Papua New Guinea. And then immediately to the southeast of Bougainville are the islands of Solomon Islands, which I'm also going to be talking about today. I think an important point to note here is that, and this is, in the context of this being a security course, what are the security dimensions of what I'm talking about today? Well, this region of Melanesia in recent decades has hosted a significant amount of conflict and insecurity. Indeed, one could argue that it has been characterized by conflict and insecurity of various types in recent decades, which of course has given rise to it being characterized by Australian security thinkers and policymakers as an arc of instability. Now you'll just have to excuse me for a minute, I have a phone call. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So I was just talking about how Melanesia, from the perspective of Australian security people, has been viewed as a part of an arc of instability, right? That stretches from the islands of Indonesia right down through Papua New Guinea into Solomon Islands and extending to Fiji in the east. Now, a final point I'll make before moving on about this region of Melanesia is that it is characterized by extraordinary diversity, right? So you may have heard that, in Papua New Guinea there are 700 languages, which is 20% of the world's languages, and this ethno-linguistic diversity is really shared across the region. And just another quick point to note is that the vast majority of people in Melanesia continue to live in rural areas. So broadly speaking, about 80% of people across the region continue to live in rural villages where their livelihoods are very much dependent on customary land, so land which hasn't been brought into the formal system of registration and titling, and where local level governance is really provided by a range of actors, including both the state and non-state actors, or what we might call informal or customary institutions, such as those associated with chiefly authority. Okay, so I mentioned before that the region in recent decades has been characterized by a great deal of conflict and insecurity, and this table gives us a sense of, the range or spectrum of what we might call organized political violence that has taken place in the region in recent years. And we can see here everything from urban land riots all the way through to a full-scale secessionist conflict in the case of Bougainville, where it's been estimated that up to 20,000 people were died. So this is the kind of spectrum of violence and instability that we've seen in the region in recent years. And again, importantly, returning to this point of, what does this matter in terms of security, in terms of the security of the region from the perspective of Australia? Well, a number of these conflicts have deeply implicated Australia. Australia's been involved in costly peace building and state building interventions in the case of Bougainville, and especially in the case of Solomon Islands with the recent regional assistance mission to Solomon Islands, RAMSI. Okay, so moving on now to looking at some theories that have been put forward to explain this contemporary phenomenon of developing country conflict. And I note again, as I'm sure that you are aware, the predominant form of violent conflict in the contemporary world is conflict that takes place within developing countries, intrastate developing country conflict. And following here a fellow called Christopher Kramer, who's written a book called Civil War is Not a Stupid Thing, we might identify, broadly speaking, 4 kind of theories, again, problematic because each of them is a kind of a master narrative of conflict, but 4 theories that have been put forward in the literature to explain contemporary intrastate conflict in developing country contexts. And these are inequality, resource scarcity, resource abundance, and ethnicity. Now here, in this lecture, I'm going to be bracketing inequality, resource scarcity, and ethnicity, a very problematic bracketing because, as I mentioned earlier, conflicts are never monocausal, and in many cases there's some combination of all 4 of these factors as well as many others. It provides, as part of the explanatory framework for any particular conflict. But here I'm going to be focusing on resource abundance, right? Resource abundance, the so-called resource wars. Now, there's been a proliferation of studies by political scientists and economists, looking at the relationships between variables of different types, but in particular, the relationship between resource abundance, so having a large number of resource industries, exports in your economy, and the likelihood that you are going to experience a violent civil conflict. So these are complex quantitative econometric studies that are looking for relationships between these sorts of variables. And this table provides a kind of a review of some of the studies that were done in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And if we just take one of them, for example, the one at the top, Collier and Hoffler, 1998, they looked at 27 wars. Their measure of resource abundance was the proportion of primary exports in a country's GDP. Their dependent variable was war onset, and they found that there was a positive relationship between these 2 variables. So this means that if you have a high proportion of primary export commodities in your gross domestic product, then it is more likely that you will experience a violent civil conflict.